Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Psalm 87, a song of the city of God. We have a very brief superscription. Actually, the whole psalm is going to be rather short, only 7 verses. A psalm of the sons of Korah, a song, and thus introduces the song. Now we begin the psalm itself. His foundation is in the holy mountains. And then we find out who his is in verse 2. The Lord loves the gates of Zion. So notice it starts off, I think it's starting off with God. I think that his in verse 1 is the same as the Lord in verse 2. That he loves the gates of Zion. Of course, Zion is the term that is popularly used to describe Jerusalem, but Jerusalem is more of a secular name. After all, the city of Jerusalem was actually there before it became a Jewish city. Before that, it was a Canaanite city, and sometimes it always had Canaanite rulers. Sometimes those rulers, I think of going back to Abraham's day, there was someone there named Melchizedek, and he was a priest of the Most High God. But later on, in the days of Joshua, there was a king by the name of Adonizedek in charge of Jerusalem, and he was against the people of God. So here it's the Lord loves the gates of Zion. That seems to indicate more the spiritual aspect of Jerusalem, the holy aspect, the aspect that's dedicated to the Lord Himself. And so He loves the gates of Zion more than all the other dwelling places of Jacob. There were other places. In fact, today, if you go to Israel, there are some beautiful places, some very significant places throughout the land of Israel. But there's something special about Jerusalem. And I think that's the point here. The Lord loves the gates of Zion more than all the other dwelling places of Jerusalem. Glorious things are spoken of you, O city of God. And so, as we focus now on Jerusalem, that city that's built on a hill, that's among the mountains, beautiful place, but a special city where great things have happened. And notice how glorious things are spoken of you. God did do. I like to think He is doing and will do great things in His city. Verse 4: I shall mention Rahab. And here I have to pause because this term Rahav, and let's look at the Hebrew. Now, our English word looks a lot like this person in Joshua that's introduced back in Joshua chapter 2. Remember Rahab, but that's a different spelling. So I have two Hebrew terms side by side. One is Rahav. Notice there's a little guttural in the middle versus Rahav, and actually the way I pronounce it, even with the vowels, I'm probably letting a almost like a pretend Boston accent in there. My apologies. Um, but Rahab is actually the name of the harlot from Jericho who helped the spies, and then Rahab. Notice there's not that little guttural in the hay. The term itself just seems to mean pride or arrogance. That's the basic definition. Although it might be that that term pride and arrogance really comes from some other symbolism. We're going to look at that in just a moment. But look at just the two. Now, even if you can't read Hebrew, you can tell that that middle letter, that middle, what we call radical, I have a het on one side and a hey on the other. And yes, those letters look a little bit alike, like the English letters O, the capital O, and the capital Q look alike, but there's in the Q, it has this little extra dash, something akin to that, that makes the het and the hey two separate letters. And here we have Rahab, not Rahav. You say, well, didn't you say the same thing twice? Not quite. I know it sounds like. So what I have in this Rahav, here's some other places where it's used. Psalm 90, verse 10. I know we haven't gotten to Psalm 90 yet, but just a few chapters later. As for the days of our life, they contain 70 years, or of due to strength, 80 years. Yet their, and here it is, yet their pride, their Rahav, is but labor and sorrow, for soon it is gone and we fly away. So, their pride, their arrogance, that could you could take that either way. You also see in Job chapter 26 and verse 12, speaking of God acting, how he quieted the sea with his power, and by his understanding he shattered Rahab. And now, in this case, our translators, I have to chuckle. Um, when the translators aren't quite sure how to translate it, either a question of they're not sure of the meaning, or maybe it's a word that has a few different nuances. And the translators are aware of those nuances, but rather than decide between one or the other, they just give you the Hebrew word because the Hebrew word will have both nuances. And I think that might be what's happening here. There is this idea of pride and arrogance, but there's something else that is behind the scenes. And that is that this term Rahab, pride, is used as a reference to a mythical sea monster. In fact, that might be where the whole pride idea in the word comes from. Now, which came first, the pride or the sea monster? I'm not sure about that. I'm not going to try to take sides on that. But it might be that the sea monster idea gives rise to the basic definition. Notice he shattered Rahab. You also see Isaiah chapter 51 and verse 9. I think it's a little clearer here, where in Isaiah he says, "Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of the Lord. Awake as in the days of old, the generations of long ago." Here it is. "Was it not you who cut Rahab in pieces?" And then because this is poetry, and in Hebrew poetry you say it and then you say it with separate words. "Was it not you who cut Rahab in pieces or pierced the dragon?" So Rahab and the dragon are sort of in a way saying the same thing. Two different Hebrew words, but saying the same thing. I think this is that idea, borrowing the imagery of that mythical sea monster idea. Isaiah chapter 30 and verse 7, you have one other aspect, one other way that this term can be used. Notice, even Egypt. Now, Egypt was a place name. That's the place where the Israelites had been back in the days of Joseph, and they'd come out of Egypt in the Exodus event. Even Egypt, whose help is vain and empty. Therefore, I have called her. Who's the her? It's Egypt. I have called her Rahab, who has been exterminated. Sort of taking that sea monster idea, and God has had a fight with the sea monster, and God won. But the sea monster there, at least, is picturing Egypt. So it's used as a symbolic reference to the land of Egypt. And I think that's what's happening here in Psalm 87. So I know that was sort of a long route to get back to the meaning of one word, but I do think it was necessary. So when he says, I shall mention Rahab, I think he's talking about the land of Egypt. Notice Rahab and Babylon among those who know me. Behold, Philistia and Tyre with Ethiopia, and of those it's going to be said, this one was born there. Now, what's it saying? As we're talking about Rahab slash Egypt and Babylon and Philistia and Tyre and Ethiopia, and notice it's going to be said of those places, this one was born there. You mean the people that are born in Egypt are born in Egypt? Well, no, I don't think it's that. I think it's talking about God's people, how you have God's people, and even God's people that were born not in Israel, but in other places. Why were they born in other places? Well, in the case of Egypt, they were born in Egypt because in the days of Joseph, they had moved down there. And not only did they move there in the days of Joseph, but at a much later date, after in that period after uh, Haggai and Malachi, and after the completion of the Old Testament, or at least the great majority of it, you have again another captivity that takes place. So one of the Greek kings over Egypt, Ptolemy the First, comes into Jerusalem and he takes some of the Jewish people captive and he takes them down to Egypt. It's like another Egyptian captivity where they settle, and even after they're free to go home, they continue to be in Egypt, and especially in that city in the very northern tip of Egypt, the city of Alexandria. There began to be, and continue to be, all the way up to New Testament times, a Jewish colony there. A You could call it a Jewish community that was there in Egypt, and not only in Egypt, but notice Babylon is mentioned here as well, and Philistia and Tyre and Ethiopia. So if we just look at a map, we already said Rahab slash Egypt. there were Jewish people that were living there who counted Jerusalem as their spiritual homeland, and yet here they were actually being born in Egypt. And not only Egypt, but Babylon as well. You know, you have the Babylonian captivity, and yes, the Jewish people were taken away to Babylon, but then eventually allowed to return, but not all of them did. So that for many hundreds and over 1,000 years, there were Jewish communities that continued to be in Mesopotamia and more specifically in Babylon. There was a whole, in fact, we've got some writings called the Babylonian Talmud. And the reason it's called that is because these were the writings of Jewish rabbis, but they were writing from Babylon. And many years after, actually after Jesus had come and died and risen again, many hundreds of years after that. So you have Babylon, Philistia, that's the area of southern Canaan, but right along the coast. Now, I'm not sure how many Jewish people migrated there, but remember back in the days of the Old Testament, you had people of both Philistia as well as Tyre that would have been at the time of the Babylonian captivity, if not later on, captured and sold as slaves and found a homeland there. Um, and then the last one is way outside of the land. You know, these were all in the Middle East, but Ethiopia, and that's located way to the south. Now you say, wait a second, isn't modern day Ethiopia further south and further east? But the Hebrew here is Cush rather than Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a Greek designation. Cush is what we read here in the biblical text. And Cush was just the land to the south of Egypt. If you continued following the Nile to the south, you know, further, you're going upriver, you eventually come to Cush. And here we translated it, for better, for worse, we translated it Ethiopia. Um, and that was also a place where Jewish people found themselves. We know from archaeology that if you travel south from Egypt all the way to the very borders of Cush, there's a place where you have the first, what they call the first cataract, the first waterfall. There's an island there. And today it's the area of Aswan, where there's been a big dam built in more recent times. But there's an ancient island there called the Island of the Elephants. We call it Elephantine Island. And it's called that because it had these stone, big giant rocks near the waterfalls that if you use your imagination, they look like big elephants just walking up out of the river. And there was a Jewish community there. And we know that because we actually have official letters that were written in the days of the Persians to the emperor of Persia, saying we'd like to build a temple down here. They'd actually had a place of worship that had been destroyed, and they were rebuilding it. So we know that there were Jewish people living there, and now we know not only there, but even further south in the area of Cush, that there were Jewish communities there that had made their way south and brought their scriptures. And we've actually checked in more recent times with DNA studies, and people said, you know, they'd been claiming to be, well, we're really Jewish, and then they conducted some DNA studies, and lo and behold, they really were. It was quite a surprise to quite a few people. So there's a sense in which, notice what's being said here, these various places, it will be said, this one was born there. Well, certainly if they're living in these various places, Tyre, Philistia, Egypt, Babylon, Ethiopia, the people that are living there were born there. But I don't think that's what it's saying. I think they consider their true birthplace back in the city of God, back in Zion, back in the place where God had initially revealed himself. And so verses 1 through 3, we read about how the Lord loved Jerusalem. That set the stage for what we're looking at. And here in verse 4, we see that there were Jews scattered to all of these various locations, and yet they still had their identity, not being Egyptian or Babylonian or Philistine or Tyranian or Ethiopic, that is from Cush. Yes, they were from those places, but they still kept their Jewish identity. And at heart, their real place was in the city of God. And I think that's the point that's being made here in verse 4. This one, this one was born there. But now we see how that phrase is going to be repeated when we get to verse 5. Let's look. Verse 5, but of Zion it will be said, this one and that one were born here. In other words, there's something special of being not just Jewish, not just having that heritage, but actually being born in that place. There's something there, those that were able to return to the city, and they held on to that heritage, not just as a long distance heritage, but they got up close and personal. They returned, they rebuilt the temple, they remained in the land, and the Most High Himself will establish her. Notice how he's called the Most High at the end of verse 5. And then he's called by the divine name. The Lord will count when he registers the peoples. What does he say? This one was born there. And notice how we've had that phrase. This is the third time we're seeing it with a few little variations. This one and this one was born there. Selah, stop and think about that. Just pause and reflect. So here in verses 5 and 6, you have this idea, yes, there are those that were scattered, but many of those shall return, and many did. There are still folks today sometimes that are going back to Jerusalem, and that's a wonderful thing. And I don't think that's the end of the topic. And those from other nations will also be God's people, both in the physical sense, but I don't think it's limited to that. Remember, because we didn't call it Jerusalem, we called it Zion and the city of God. And we emphasize those spiritual aspects so that for the Christian, we look at Jerusalem, we look at and we see that it is there that God did something special by having our Lord and Savior. Now, he wasn't born in Jerusalem, but he came there to die, to be delivered up on the cross, to be buried, and to rise again. And it was at Jerusalem that the New Testament church was born. So this one, can I call it that? This one was born there from other nations. Remember, the early church was all Jewish, but it didn't stay all Jewish. It moved out from there to all the world, where we have both Jews and Gentiles and people from every nation and ethnicity and background that recognizes God as their king, and Jerusalem as the place where God brought it all together to make it happen. So we see verse 7, then those who sing, as well as those who play the flutes, shall say, all my springs of joy are in you. Now notice the singing and the playing of the flutes. This is celebration. And why they are celebrating, notice all my springs, and our translators added of joy. And I think that's, frankly, I would have been okay if they hadn't done that. I don't think it's wrong. I think there is joy in the song. But that term of joy is added by the translators to try to get the sense of what's happening. But notice you have the springs that are there, and the springs are in you. Now that brings to mind something from the Newer Testament. In Revelation chapter 7, and that chapter begins with an angelic counting where there are 12 tribes of Israel that are counted by numbers, 12,000 in each tribe. The actual tribes are sort of funny because you have a tribe of Joseph. Remember, there was actually Joseph's inheritance were two tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh. So that changes a bit, but still 12 tribes, and they are counted. And now, as we hit verse 9, John, the writer, turns to look. He's heard the counting 12,000 from each tribe, and the total is 144,000. So he turns to look, and he expects to see 144,000. But instead, after these things, I looked, and behold, a great multitude, which no one could count. You just heard this counting, but no one could count this. From every nation and all tribes and peoples and tongues standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, and palm branches were in their hands. And they cry out with a loud voice, saying, salvation to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. We continue, verse 13. Then one of the elders answered, saying to me, these who are clothed in the white robes, who are they? And where have they come from? Verse 14, I said to him, my Lord, you know. And he said to me, these are the ones who come out of the great tribulation, and they have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Verse 15, for this reason, they are before the throne of God. Remember how our psalm here started off with Jerusalem, with the place of God's city. These are before the throne of God, and they serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne will spread his tabernacle over them. They will hunger no longer, nor thirst any more, nor will the sun beat down on them, nor any heat. For the Lamb in the center of the throne will be their shepherd and will guide them. And here's why we read this: guide them to springs of the water of life. Remember how Psalm 87:7 ends? All my springs, and our translators added, of joy are in you. Well, here, they're going to be guided to the springs of the water of life. That's a reference that goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 2. And God will wipe every tear from their eyes. Now, John, the same writer who writes Revelation, I think it's the same writer, also writes in the Gospel of John about these same, can I call them these same springs, although he's going to use a different word. On the last day, the great day of the feast, is John 7:37, Jesus stood and cried out, saying, if anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. He who believes in me, as the scripture said, from his innermost being will flow, not springs, but rivers of living water. A river tends to be a bit bigger than a spring. You notice the water is going to get multiplied. There's going to be a lot more of it. But, verse 39, but this he spoke of the Spirit, whom those who believed in him were to receive, for the Spirit was not yet given because Jesus was not yet glorified. Notice here in Psalm 87, it will be said of those who sing, those who celebrate, those who play the flutes will say, all my springs, translators added, of joy. And that's okay, because I think it is going to be joyful. But all my springs are in you. And that's what was promised by Jesus, that from the Spirit, from their innermost beings, will flow these springs, will flow these rivers of living water. So that those who enter into this psalm are not just those who were born in Jerusalem, not just those who are physically Jewish, but those who have been united by faith to the one who came and died and rose again in Jerusalem, and therefore are called by his name.